Good day. So we are wrapping up the week. Actually, I misspoke for the last talk, suggesting that the week was being wrapped up. But we're really wrapping up the week um, with the transition from what we've called the slave narratives into um, into the beginning of a kind of fictional, the beginning of a literary practice, and so on. Chronologically, this would fall a little outside of a straight line, although in terms of the publications, apart from writers like Charles Chestnut and a number of other black writers in the late 19th century, the 18th century was dominated by slave narratives or post slavery narratives by people like Booker T. Washington, the introduction of new thoughts by people like W.B. Du Bois, turn of the century, the souls of black folk, and of course the autobiographies that we discussed to an extended extent in the last few days. So what we begin to see happening is these accounts begin to be transformed into something different. And here is a peculiar circumstance. James Weldon Johnson was born in the late 1800s and would have a very fascinating life. It's worth looking at his biography, it's easily accessible. Um, he was, amongst other things, a writer, and we'll see this in terms of the book that we are looking at. He was a musician, and with his brother, they together composed um, librettos and other musical pieces. For a while, they worked and performed in Tin Pan Alley, which would have been the sort of precursor of Broadway. And so they were involved in minstrel shows and things like that. They were very talented. James Weldon Johnson is the author, the person who actually authored the African American anthem, "Lift Every Voice and Sing." He's the lyricist for that, along with his son, and I mean with his brother. He also published poetry, a good deal of poetry. One of his most famous works of poetry is God's Trombone, and God's Trombone is a very complex and very interesting examination of Christianity in the context of the African American experience and so on. But he would go on to become one of the first leaders of the NAACP. He would become also one of the first editors of African American publications during the Harlem Renaissance and was very influential in the emergence of African American writers. He was one of the sort of stalwarts in Harlem doing that work. A massive figure, to be quite honest with you, and one that continues to resonate in the minds of people when they think about the emergence of a black identity and a black sensibility in the in the early 20th century. Now, one of the interesting things is that there's a presumption that there is a close relationship between James Weldon Johnson and the character in the autobiography of an ex-colored man. The ex-colored man himself was passable; he could pass as white. If you go online and you put in James Weldon Johnson and do images, you'll see very quickly that James Weldon Johnson couldn't pass as white, but he would be in the context and the vernacular of African American language. He would be seen as light skinned, but certainly not passing for white. He was a black man. James Weldon Johnson would die tragically. He would die in a car accident, I think in around 1930. And I forgot to mention that prior to that, he was an ambassador. He was made ambassador to a couple of countries in Latin America, and therefore was attached to the United States government. Very, very complex and very rich existence and a very rich life for a very highly educated individual. So then we come to think about the autobiography of an ex-colored man, which was first published in 1912. The thing to remember, though, is that it was published anonymously. In other words, the book came out without an author's name to it, and therefore it was presumed to be the actual autobiography of an ex-colored man. That is, that a man who had, as he says in the work, decided that he's going to pass for white and live as a white man, because he was so light-skinned that he could pass for white. And for from 1912 until 1928, when this book was republished, the presumption was that this was not a work of fiction, but actually a work of personal narrative, by an anonymous artist, anonymous writer, not an artist, but an anonymous writer. In 1928, the book was republished, and James Weldon Johnson attached his name to it, and that's when we started to call it a novel. And of course, it's an interesting novel because it is a narrative. It's a slave narrative, and at least a post-slavery narrative, but in the tradition of the narrative, the slave narrative, in the tradition of the narrative that is intended to teach something interesting about race in America, to make sociological, political, and ideological comment on slave society in America. And if you keep that in mind, remember what we said about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. Frederick Douglass's books, his three biographies, were intended as articulations of his own personal making, the making of him, but were primarily intended as a profound critique, not just of slavery and slave society, but of course of American society and so on. And in many ways, James Weldon Johnson borrows heavily from this aesthetic, this kind of poetic articulation, this structure and conception to write his novel. And so I don't want to overstate the point, but the point is that one of the things about a vernacular and one of the things about an aesthetic is that it offers literary models for writers to use. And there is, in the tradition of the African American novel, the tradition of the narrative that exposes, that tells the story of the making of an individual, and that also positions the black individual as surviving and trying to make a life in the midst of the racism and the challenges of race in American society. So this is in fact one of the interesting frameworks for the work. One of the first ways to think about it, though, is for us to look very quickly at, and I'm going to spend this talk, in both parts of this talk, looking at actual passages from the work, which I'll read and then we can comment on, because I think it's important to position it. This is a narrative that tells a story of a man who is born to a light-skinned woman, but she's mixed race, African-American mixed race woman, and a white man. And this is a clandestine relationship. They were never married, and they never are able to have a proper relationship. So she has this child. The father cares for him, but the father kind of abandons the family. And so he grows up essentially as this light-skinned black boy. They leave the South and move to, I think it's in Michigan that he's living in. And there in Michigan, he begins to go to school, and not long after that, because he realizes that he can pass, he gets away with many things. And there's a certain particular point in his life when he's in grade school, and he perceives himself as white because he doesn't look any different from the other kids that are in the school. He perceives himself as white, and a teacher decides to ask to point out, to ask the question about who are the black kids in the class, and they ask the black kids especially to stand up, and he doesn't stand up. And finally, the teacher tells him that he should stand up as well, that he's black. This is the first time he realizes that he is black, and certainly the teacher knew that he was black. His friends, his other black friends, were very black. They were noticeably black, and he will come back to stories about them later on, and they would all have great success. But he was torn in this place, and from that moment on, he's torn by the fact that he's black, but he could also pass as white, and he wrestles with this idea. And it's a very interesting idea because, of course, what James Weldon Johnson is constructing is a narrative that says, what if a black man has access to white society? Now, this is a novel idea, and it certainly was a novel idea in his publication in 1912. We've seen this repeated, and you're not old enough, most of you, to know that there's a film in the 1980s, I think, called Trading Places. And there's also an earlier film in which a white man puts on blackface, puts on, I think it's Gene Wilder, puts on all the makeup and becomes a black man and goes into black society and experiences all the elements of racism. It's not a fictional story. It's a story that is fictionalized, but there's an actual white man who did this work and wrote a book about it. And he wrote a book about it to expose white society to just how difficult emotionally and in all small and large ways racism operated in American society, in everyday ways in American society. A white man living for a year, less than a year, as a black man. In trading places, of course, there's a flip side where there's a black man who passes for white, and lives as a white person, and also discovers all the privileges and wonderful joys of being white. So that's the premise of the work. It's a very interesting premise. But James Weldon Johnson has an intention and has an agenda. Let's look very quickly at the preface to this work, because there's a preface to the original edition in 1912 that I want us to think about and ask questions about for ourselves. And one of the first things I want you to think about as I read this is to ask yourself, who is the intended audience for this book based on the preface that it's written here? And what exactly is going on in terms of the way that it positions the work and positions African American life in America around the issue of race. So this is how the preface, and remember, the preface is almost like an editorial blurb. This is the way that the book will be promoted. This is the way that the book will be sold. This is the way that we'll be asked to be interested in reading the book. So here we go. This vivid and startlingly new picture of conditions brought about by the race question in the United States makes no special plea for the Negro, but shows in a dispassionate, though sympathetic manner, conditions as they actually exist between the whites and the blacks today. Special pleas have already been made for and against the Negro in hundreds of books, but in these books, either in his virtues or his vices have been exaggerated. This is because writers in nearly every instance have treated the colored American as a whole. Each has taken some one group of the race to prove his case. Not before has a composite and proportionate representation of the entire race, embracing all of its various groups and elements, showing their relations with each other and to the whites, been made. It's very likely that the Negroes of the United States have a fairly correct idea of what the white people of the country think of them, for that opinion has for a long time been, and it's still being constantly stated, but they are themselves more or less a sphinx to the whites. It is curiously interesting that even vitally important to know what are the thoughts of 10 millions of them concerning the people among whom they live. In these pages, it is as though a veil had been drawn aside. The reader is given a view of the inner life of the Negro in America and is initiated into the Freemasonry, in quotations, as it were, of the race. These pages also reveal the unsuspected fact that prejudice against the Negro is exerting a pressure which in New York and other large cities where the opportunity is open is actually and constantly forming an uncertainable number of fair-complexioned colored people over into the right race. In this book, the reader is given a glimpse behind the scenes of this race drama, which is being here enacted. He is taken upon an elevation where he can catch a bird's eye view of the conflict which is being waged. The publishers. Now, this is a fascinating preface and introduction. And I asked the question, who is being addressed here? It's clear that this book was not written for a black audience. Because as it says in this paragraph, it is very likely that the Negroes of the United States have a fairly correct idea of what the white people of the country think of them. for that opinion has for a long time been and is still being constantly stated. That is, the presumption is that black people know what white people's lives are because they've had access to it forever and ever, and so they have all the information that they need. But they are themselves more or less a sphinx to the whites. It's a very, very bold statement. And I've always been fascinated about whether that statement can still be true today, despite all the reality shows that we see, despite all the TV shows that we see depicting the life of African Americans. Do we think that African American life is accessible and is known and understood entirely by white society? What he's saying is in 1912, this is not the case. And so consequently, the book that is going to be written, the book that they are being encouraged to read, is attempting to give as clear a view of the prejudice against the Negro, and also the life of the Negro in America. And he describes it as a Freemasonry. Freemasonry is referring to referring to the Masons, the organization that is called the Masons, which is a secret society for, usually it began over the years as a secret society for tradesmen. Tradesmen would form these societies in which they would have a kind of bond with each other and begin to assert ways in which they would look after each other quietly. But these were secret societies, and they existed all over Europe. They, in the novel War and Peace. One of the great novels of our time, Tolstoy's novel War and Peace. In the middle, there's a whole passage about a whole chapter, a whole section that focuses on Masons and the life of Masons and the secret life of Masons, and of course the danger and pernicious nature of that life. But he's describing the experience of African Americans to white people as a kind of secret society that is going to be revealed. Of course, when you read the book, you realize that the only revelations that are taking place are what this black man sees of white society because of the way he can pass. But this preface is trying to get white people to read the book. That's actually the key point. The other thing about this preface, which is very interesting, is that it creates this sense of terror and horror. This idea of horror that says, of alarm in society, and he says, and this almost seems like the trailer for one of these sensational TV shows, right? And he said, because these pages also reveal the unsuspected fact that prejudice against the Negro is exerting a pressure which in New York and other large cities, where large populations who might buy the book are, where the opportunity is open, because unlike the South, where the opportunity is not open, and continues, is actually and constantly forcing an uncertainable number of fair complexioned colored people over into the white race. Oh my God. This is the point for great alarm. In other words, the book's introduction is saying, look to your home. Check it out, because your son may be marrying a black woman, but he doesn't know this because she's actually been hiding. She's passing. Or your daughter could be marrying a black man and he's passing, because of course in this novel, this is exactly the circumstance that happens. The black man passes for white and marries a white woman and has a whole family, and the family doesn't know he's black until he confesses it to the wife later on. And of course, there's that whole drama that ensues because of it. So it is sensationalizing it, and it's a way to share it. But of course, James Weldon Johnson was not just interested in creating sensation, but he was interested in analyzing how race operates in America and the dangers of race in America. Johnson actually started writing this novel while he was an ambassador. He was in I think in Bolivia or somewhere like that, where he started to write this novel and completed this novel soon after and published it. And like I said, he published it anonymously. Finally, the last image in this section is that in this book, the reader is given a glimpse behind the scenes of this race drama, which is being here enacted. He's taken upon an elevation where he can catch a bird's eye view of the conflict which is being waged. So he calls it a race drama. And in this book, there are moments of incredible violence, incredible danger, and moments of deep introspection and consideration. So this is the framework upon which this story is being told, and this is the beginning of the autobiography of an ex-colored man. All right, and so when we go into the next section, we'll look at um, two framing sections, the beginning and the end, and talk about the ways in which James Weldon Johnson explores this concept, this idea of the function and the life of the ex-colored man.